Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. At the turn of the century, the face of America was changing. Hundreds of thousands of people escaping persecution or economic hardship were arriving in what was called the Golden Land, eager to build new lives. Many of them were Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia. Although President Theodore Roosevelt is remembered as one of our greatest leaders, few today know about his relationship with these newcomers and how he worked to promote their acceptance and participation in American life, believing it would benefit the nation as a whole. Today, we'll explore that story and much more with historian Andrew Porwancher, author of the new book, American Maccabee, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. It's a deep dive into how one of America's most iconic presidents forged a deep, enduring bond with Jewish Americans, and how those ties influenced his political decisions and helped to shape his presidency. Andrew Porwancher is a professor of history at Arizona State University and the author of 5 books, including The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, which won the Journal of the American Revolution Book of the Year Award. He's held fellowships at Harvard, Oxford, Princeton, and earned his PhD at Cambridge University. With American Maccabee, he uncovers a new historical view, new historical way of looking at Theodore Roosevelt and how Roosevelt's connection to the Jewish community ran far deeper than most Americans realize. But before we get into our conversation, a quick reminder: if you enjoy this program, subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch all of our past episodes, and follow us on Facebook to stay updated with all of our latest content. What makes Roosevelt's story so compelling is how his relationship with Jewish Americans evolved throughout his life, from his days as New York's police commissioner to his years in the White House. He built lasting friendships with Jewish leaders and everyday citizens alike, like B'nai B'rith's own Simon Wolf, a trusted presidential advisor. Roosevelt also spoke out against anti-Semitic violence abroad, and he wrestled with questions that still resonate today: immigration, assimilation, and what it means to be an American. Through it all, he demonstrated a willingness to stand up for Jewish rights, even when it wasn't politically advantageous. And through it all, he demonstrated a willingness to stand up for Jewish rights, even when it wasn't politically clear that he was doing, in the view of many, the right thing. And as Mr. Porwancher shows in American Maccabee, Roosevelt was both ahead of his time as well as a product of it. A leader whose ideals and contradictions continue to speak more to us more than a century later. Andrew, thanks for being with us today and for shining new light on these rarely told stories about Roosevelt's relationship with the Jewish community. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to get to be on this podcast, in part because B'nai B'rith plays such a central role in the story of Roosevelt's relationship with the Jewish community. So it is a real treat for me to get a chat with you and connect with your audience.
Well, that's great. Well, you've written about the Jewish world of Alexander Hamilton. Let's start there. Now you've turned to Theodore Roosevelt. What drew you to Roosevelt's relationship with the Jewish community, and what gap do you feel American Maccabee needed to fill?
Well, you're absolutely right to see a connection between these books. In the Jewish world of Alexander Hamilton, I discuss how Hamilton was the most philo-Semitic of all the American founders at an age when the question of Jewish belonging in America was very much contested terrain. Hamilton sought to forge a republic in which Jew and Gentile would stand as equals. And that book directly led to my interest in Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was really enamored of Alexander Hamilton. And before the Broadway musical made Hamilton a household favorite in America over the past decade, Hamilton, people forget, was really the punching bag of the American founders. He wasn't really the most popular founder. Folks like Madison and Adams and Jefferson were held in higher esteem. And so it was pretty striking to me that Roosevelt was so enamored of Alexander Hamilton. And it made me wonder if Roosevelt shared Hamilton's philo-Semitic instinct, shared this appreciation of the people and faith of Judaism. And it turned out that Roosevelt very much had a deep bond with the Jewish community that was unprecedented in the history of the American presidency. And what I thought was going to start as a short book ended up becoming my longest book because the historical record was so rich and so colorful and so dramatic when it came to the story of TR and the tribe. So in terms of the gap, no one had written a book before about Roosevelt's relationship with the Jewish community. For all of the centrality of Jewish people and Jewish causes to Roosevelt's career and to his presidency in particular, it is rather remarkable that no one had ever given this subject a book-length treatment. And I'm really honored to get to be the first person to bring this story to the public.
Interesting, notwithstanding the fact that New York was, at the point of his being police commissioner, had the largest Jewish community in the United States, and that no one had thought to put the two together. Well, it's a tribute to you that you decided to do this. In your book, you characterize Theodore Roosevelt, known as TR, as someone who actively rejected the world of his own privileged upbringing. He embraced life as a cowboy, as a big game hunter, and rough rider, who worked hands-on as New York City's police commissioner. Now, how did his out-of-the-box thinking and how he saw himself and his encounters with people outside his own class shape his sympathy for the Jewish people? Do you think that this outlook alienated him from his own social circles as he was doing this?
Yeah, the class dimension is a really interesting one. So I'm glad that you asked about it. There is a division among the Protestant elites who dominated American culture at that time. There were some people who were more reactionary, who wanted to curb Jewish immigration, who didn't really care much for elite Jews trying to find their way into their country clubs and prep schools. And they certainly didn't much care for the indigent Jewish refugees fleeing Eastern Europe, who were moistening their brows in the sweatshops of places like the Lower East Side. And Roosevelt had many friends who you could categorize as anti-Semites, and yet Roosevelt himself largely rejected that anti-Semitism. When he was a rising figure in New York's political scene, when he was just in his early 20s, he threatened to terminate his membership in a Republican club when some fellow participants sought to exclude a Jewish applicant on purely religious grounds. And Roosevelt continued to engage Jews and other ethnic minorities, as you note, in his time as police commissioner. He would take these midnight strolls with the Danish-American reformer Jacob Riis, and they would go through slums like the Lower East Side, which was the largest Jewish neighborhood in America at that time. And they would look at the tenements and they would look at sweatshops. And Roosevelt really had firsthand engagement with the kinds of dire conditions that newly settled immigrants were enduring in American urban slums at that time in places like New York and elsewhere. And part of Roosevelt's approach, this extension of a hand to the outsider, I believe is born out of his faith commitments. He grows up in a particular strain of Christianity known as social gospel Protestantism, which emphasized practicing your faith through deeds, which placed a premium on extending your hand to the stranger. And so there's an important relationship here between the particular kind of Christianity that Roosevelt espoused and some of his outreach to Jews and other immigrant groups. American Christianity at that time, I might hasten to add, was, like so much else in America, divided. Some of the most virulent anti-Semites and some of the most impassioned defenders of Jews were themselves members of the Christian clergy. So it is a complicated backdrop in which Roosevelt is operating in this era.
So why did you choose the title American Maccabee? How did Roosevelt's admiration for the Maccabees reflect an understanding of Jewish identity, courage, and belonging to America? It's a great title. How did it come about for you?
Well, I really have to send my apologies to my wife because when we were on our honeymoon, I was subjecting her at every meal to an endless list of titles that I was cycling through because I had to decide what the title was going to be. It happened to coincide with our honeymoon trip, and she was incredibly patient with me. So the book is dedicated to her, and rightly so. I chose American Maccabee because Roosevelt was deeply enamored of the Maccabees, those ancient Jewish warrior rebels who revolted against Greek rule and established a Jewish kingdom in the Holy Land. Roosevelt was someone who was always drawn to emblems of heroism, of martial glory. I think this grows out of his own frailty in childhood. You know, we think of him as this really macho figure, but that was very much a curated image that he spent years investing in as a way of overcoming the shame he felt for being so sickly and anemic as a child. And so he's always drawn to these figures of martial glory, of courage, of vigor, of valor. And in the Maccabean tradition, he finds these Jewish heroes that he believes can be a model for American Jews to emulate. When he was recruiting Jews to the police force, he liked to say that he was always on the lookout for what he called the Maccabee type of Jew. And Roosevelt, in a way, is gesturing towards a certain pluralistic strain in his thinking. When he is elevating the Maccabees as a model for American Jews, he's not saying you have to deny your Jewish identity to belong in America, but actually by leaning in to your own proud heritage, you can become proud Americans. So there's something really deeply resonant about this Maccabean theme in Roosevelt's thinking, and that is why I chose to title the book American Maccabee.
Well, you tell a remarkable story from Roosevelt's time as New York City police commissioner when Herman Alvart, an anti-Semitic German writer, came to speak in New York. Roosevelt purposely appointed an all-Jewish police detail to provide security for him. Um, what was the intention behind this? I mean, maybe I'm asking a rhetorical question. That's a great story. Tell us more about it.
To be sure. So, Olvert was planning this trip to America to spread his hateful message. He provocatively schedules a lecture on the Lower East Side. And there were some Jews who asked Roosevelt to bar Olvert from speaking, or at least to deny him police protection. But Roosevelt felt that he couldn't do that without upending the principle of freedom of speech. And even absent that constitutional right, Roosevelt thought that government censorship would only serve to turn Olvert into a martyr. And Roosevelt wrote that he was thinking at the time, and this is a quote, the proper thing to do was to make him ridiculous. And so to that end, as you know, Roosevelt assigns him an entirely Jewish police detail. And Roosevelt tells one of his deputies to round up Jewish policemen. And it was important to Roosevelt that these men look unmistakably Jewish. Roosevelt tells his deputy, and this is a direct quote, don't bother yourself to hunt up their religious antecedents. Take only those who have the most pronounced Hebrew physiognomy. The stronger their ancestral marking, the better. And Roosevelt demonstrated by giving Olvert this police detail that the sight of Jewish policemen guarding this German hate monger would do more to undermine Olvert's anti-Semitic message than preemptive government censorship ever could have.
Wow. Well, throughout his life, Roosevelt connected with an extraordinary range of Jewish figures, from B'nai B'rith leader Simon Wolf, who is really an iconic figure in B'nai B'rith history, to Lower East Side officer Otto Raphael and statesman Oscar Strauss. Tell us about his friendship with these men, and what do these friendships reveal about his bond with the Jewish community?
To be sure, Roosevelt relied on Jewish advisors. He respected Jewish leadership in America. And frankly, he was much more likely to take input from B'nai B'rith's leadership on issues implicating Jewish lives abroad during the pogroms than he was to rely on his own figures who were employed at the State Department, because the State Department did have a kind of genteel anti-Semitism that afflicted many of the State Department elite at the time. And so it wasn't unusual when Roosevelt was crafting his foreign policy with Eastern European countries where Jews were struggling to survive, that he would rely on people like Simon Wolf and other B'nai B'rith leaders, people like Oscar Strauss, who was the first Jew to ever sit in the cabinet of an American president. And so I think that it demonstrates Roosevelt's willingness to do it his own way, to step outside the normal channels of foreign policy making, and to understand that the Jewish community had unique insight to give him that he wasn't going to hear from some of the WASP elite who were otherwise staffing his administration. And I think that these friendships also demonstrate a kind of interesting schism within Roosevelt's relationship with the Jewish community, because a lot of the B'nai B'rith leaders, people like Simon Wolf, Oscar Strauss, they tended to come from a certain cloth. They were well-to-do, assimilated Jews who had come over from families that had migrated in the mid-19th century. Typically, they often came from Central Europe, often Germany. They practiced Reform Judaism. They had met with success in banking and law. They were called the Uptown Jews. They lived in fashionable brownstones on Tony streets. But the real challenge in American Jewish life at that time was the great mass of Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews who were new arrivals who had freshly come from places like Russia and Poland and Romania. And so Roosevelt is often relying on these uptown Jews to serve as spokesmen and intermediaries on behalf of the so-called downtown Jews, those Lower East Side Eastern European Jews who were subsisting in sweatshops and hawking goods from push carts. So there is a kind of class schism, but Roosevelt, as you know, did have some friends in the Eastern European downtown Jewish community, like Otto Raphael, who was someone that Roosevelt recruited to the police force after Otto Raphael saved numerous people from a burning building on the Lower East Side. And Raphael had some amateur boxing titles to his name, and he ends up becoming Roosevelt's sparring partner in the boxing ring. And they forge a friendship in the ring that lasts a lifetime. So there's a special place for Otto Raphael in Roosevelt's heart, although he was really disappointed not to be able to offer Raphael a spot on the Rough Riders, because Otto Raphael, for all of his boxing talents, had never ridden a horse, and so he couldn't join Roosevelt's cavalry regiment.
Well, you devote chapters to key moments when Roosevelt's actions toward Jewish communities became moral imperatives rather than political calculations. Which of these episodes do you think most clearly captures that side of the man, and which did you find the most interesting?
To my mind, the Kishinev pogrom stands out as a singular moment in Roosevelt's presidency and in his relationship with the Jewish community. In April of 1903, on Easter Sunday, in Kishinev, a city in southwestern Russia, a 2-day pogrom of unconscionable barbarity claims the lives of 47 Jews. And when its details become known in the United States, this pogrom shocks the American conscience. And this tragedy raises a foreign policy challenge for Roosevelt. Is he going to intervene diplomatically? And there were many factors that weighed in favor of some kind of intervention from Roosevelt, and many factors that weighed against. Weighing in favor was Roosevelt's longstanding relationship with and affinity for Jewry. He was drawn to the idea of America as a moral lodestar in the world. And many Americans, Jew and Gentile alike, felt the same way. There were mass protests of Jews, Christians, Chinese American immigrants, all kinds of people who came together and pleaded for Roosevelt to somehow intercede, to represent to the Tsar that America stood on the side of the embattled Jews of Russia. Yet there were all of these countervailing forces acting on Roosevelt. There was a strong diplomatic norm at that time of non-interference, wherein one nation ought not comment on the internal affairs of another, even on humanitarian grounds. And Roosevelt was under considerable pressure because no other head of state in the world had dared to challenge the czar over the pogroms. Roosevelt would be going it alone. And he risked retaliation from the Russians. The Russians could retaliate by closing prized ports to U.S. trade or severing diplomatic ties entirely. And so there was a strong feeling at the State Department that Roosevelt ought not intervene, that he ought not comment on the world stage. And so much so that Roosevelt's own Secretary of State, John Hay, was actually considering resigning in frustration over Roosevelt's willingness to contemplate an outspoken defense of this embattled Jewish community in Kishinev. And so Roosevelt boxes out the State Department. He boxes out his Secretary of State. He brings B'nai B'rith's leadership to Sagamore Hill, his summer estate on Long Island. And Roosevelt, these leaders from B'nai B'rith, Oscar Strauss, and a handful of other people who happened to be just visiting Roosevelt that day, including a British judge, a magazine editor, and Roosevelt's teenage daughter, Alice, they all get together and decide that Roosevelt is going to tap the formal channels of American diplomacy to submit to the czar a petition organized by B'nai B'rith and signed by Americans of all faith, calling on the Russian sovereign to protect the lives and liberty of his Jewish subjects. It is an extraordinary moment in which Roosevelt bucks foreign policy conventions, he bucks his own State Department, and he throws his lot in of the humanitarian cause of the Jewish people.
So this is way ahead of his time. In other words, just as the George Washington letter speaks into the tour of the congregation, the Newport congregation, speaks in terms. I mean, we're talking about the end of the 18th century, and the terms in that letter that are used are you could almost find in a human rights handbook. So what you have here is he was really way ahead of his time. Now, you also describe the deadly violence that broke out in 1905 after Tsar Nicholas was forced to create the Duma. And there was hope that the Duma, be a democratic body, would protect Russia's Jews. What did you discover about American reactions to the Bialystok pogrom?
Yeah, to be sure. So there is this brutal wave of pogroms that is set off by this announcement that there's going to be a Duma, that people, including Jews, are going to have religious liberty, that's going to be protected. It was called the October Manifesto. And when Russian Gentiles learn of this, it causes an outbreak of more than 600 pogroms over a 12-day period in November of 1905. And it is claiming Jewish lives on a scale unprecedented in the dark history of the Russian Empire. And naturally, American Jews and many of their Gentile allies called on and hoped and expected that Roosevelt would intervene, just as he had after the Kishinev pogrom. But Roosevelt opted not to because Russia at large was spiraling into a violent abyss. This unprecedented wave of pogroms was corresponding with a general dissolution of Russian society. The Tsarist regime was teetering on the brink of collapse. Lenin would later call this 1905 uprising in Russia the dress rehearsal for the Bolshevik Revolution. And Roosevelt thought that there was no good that could be had from trying to make entreaties to a government that had lost control of law and order over its own society and its own people. And Roosevelt fretted that speaking out on the world stage might actually exacerbate rather than mitigate conditions for Russia's Jews. He feared that Russian Gentiles who might resent America's bid to shame them would reassert their pride by further lashing out at their Jewish neighbors. And so Roosevelt maintains a strategic silence. And that silence felt very callous and heartbreaking to many of Roosevelt's longtime Jewish supporters who were desperate for some sort of moral clarity from the American president. And I think that this experience, as I argue in the book, demonstrates a difficult truth about foreign affairs in the world, which is that evil calamity is often very easy to identify, but it is much less straightforward to determine the optimal diplomatic response.
Well, a recurring theme in your book is Roosevelt's thinking about immigration and America as a haven for the poor and uneducated, Jewish or otherwise. Um, how did he reconcile in his mind the thinking that he was going through, um, and how often did he speak out on the immigration question?
Roosevelt articulates a number of different positions on immigration throughout his career. When you go back to the 1890s, even as he is extending a hand to many immigrant communities, Jews included, as police commissioner, he's also in that era sometimes publishing magazine pieces where he talks about, extending hands to immigrants, but only if they Americanize and throw away their old customs. It kind of sits in tension with some of the earlier pluralistic themes I was talking about. And sometimes Roosevelt, in talking about immigration, would even contradict himself in the course of a single paragraph. When he becomes president, we generally see Roosevelt embrace immigrants. He takes this symbolic visit to Ellis Island in 1903, where he announces that there's going to be a special investigatory committee whose membership that he's going to appoint, which includes Jewish representation, to uncover discrimination against immigrants at Ellis Island. And he also puts a foreign-born Jew, Oscar Strauss, in charge of administering America's immigration policy. It is really an audacious move at a time when there is a strong strain of anti-Semitic inflected xenophobia at work among many factions within the Protestant elite. And yet, Roosevelt also endorses a literacy test that, if it passed Congress, would have excluded upwards of 25% of Jewish immigrants. It would have made literacy in any language a prerequisite for admission into the country. And so the bill was neutral on its face, but it would disproportionately burden Eastern European Jews or Southern Italians whose literacy rates were much lower than immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. And so Roosevelt's concerns here were not xenophobic. He was worried that recently settled immigrants would struggle to overcome poverty if their living conditions and wages were perpetually suppressed by an unrestricted deluge of foreign labor. But many of Roosevelt's Jewish supporters were concerned that he was endorsing this literacy test being considered on the Hill because it would pose an existential risk to so many Jews who were seeking to escape habitual bouts of butchery overseas. And that bill did not end up passing Congress thanks to the efforts of the House Speaker, Uncle Joe Cannon. But if Roosevelt had had his druthers, that bill actually would have passed. Roosevelt wanted the bill to pass because it would check industries that were exploiting mass migration by paying immigrants very low wages. But ultimately, after that bill passed, Roosevelt taxed back for the rest of his administration to a more pro-immigrant position. And that's one that's very much welcomed by the Jewish community.
Well, what strikes me about the book on one of our most celebrated presidents is how timely these themes remain today. I was talking about ahead of his time in immigration, assimilation, religious freedom, standing up against hatred. These were issues that Roosevelt grappled with more than a century ago, and they continue to resonate today. But do you think, and I know, over the course of history, Jews have had engagements, encounters, experience with their presidents over the years. We've talked about George Washington and his famous letter to the Newport congregation, which at the beginning of the United States of America. But do you think that up to the time that he became president, that, let's say, between Washington and Teddy Roosevelt, can you think of another president that had this kind of command of the issue and who thought about a then vulnerable Jewish community?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In my Hamilton book, I do write a little bit about some of the earlier presidents like Jefferson and Madison, who at times could be very good on the question of religious liberty for Jews, and at times were not. Madison fires a diplomat, and he says actually the reason he's firing him is because he's Jewish. And Jefferson, the great champion of religious liberty, also often denigrated Judaism as a faith. And I guess to be fair to Jefferson, he also kind of denigrated Christianity with some regularity. He's a complicated, idiosyncratic figure. I would struggle to say that there was another president in that period who had the kind of command that you're talking about. Jonathan Sarna, the great leading scholar of American Jewish history, has written an excellent book about Lincoln's relationship with the Jews. And Lincoln was a liberal-minded guy who certainly had warm relations with the Jewish community and stood up for Jews, but he didn't have the depth of exposure that Theodore Roosevelt had. Theodore Roosevelt came of age at a time when New York City, as you were nodding to earlier, was fast becoming 28% Jewish. And there is an intimacy in Roosevelt's relationship with the Jewish community that no other president had matched. He brought Jews onto the police force. He barnstormed the Lower East Side as police commissioner. He fought alongside Jewish recruits in the Spanish-American War, where they risked their lives and limb together. Roosevelt stands up in defense of Jews with the pogroms. And it turns out, and this is a story that I'm going to be touching on in a sequel focused on Roosevelt's post-presidency, that Roosevelt, in the latter decade of his life, develops a close relationship with young Jewish writers. He actually becomes an outspoken Zionist who endorses the creation of a Jewish homeland in the Holy Land. Roosevelt's ties with the Jewish community only get deeper with age. And so perhaps in a couple of years, when I wrap up that volume, I'll have a chance to chat with you about that last part of Roosevelt's life, which introduces entirely new dimensions of the Roosevelt-Jewish connection.
Well, I'd like to do that. Before we conclude, though, I'm curious. You've done all of this research and all of this work on TR. What is your favorite lesser-known fact or story about Teddy Roosevelt?
That is a good question, because we've touched on some of my favorite ones so far regarding Otto Raphael, for instance, in the boxing ring, regarding some of his relationships with your organization, B'nai B'rith. But I'll leave you with one last vignette from Otto Raphael. Roosevelt passes away a decade after he steps down from the presidency. And the night before his funeral, his corpse is resting in the trophy room of his Sagamore Hill summer estate out on Long Island. And there was only one person who was permitted to keep vigil over Roosevelt's body the night before his burial. And that honor didn't fall to any of the famous personages who had populated his life. It didn't fall to the best man at his wedding. It didn't fall to his eldest child. In those small hours, as the world slept, Roosevelt's sole companion was a Jewish immigrant. It was Otto Raphael, his old sparring partner, was the sole figure given this honor of keeping watch over Roosevelt's body before burial. I think that it is a beautiful testament to this deep, intimate bond that Theodore Roosevelt had with the Jewish people.
Wow, what a touching story. Well, you can find American Maccabee, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews by Andrew Porwancher at bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, or wherever you get your favorite books. Andrew, thanks so much for coming by today and for sharing this behind-the-scenes look at Teddy Roosevelt's political and personal relationships with the American Jewish community and how he stood up for it. We appreciate your being here.
Thank you so much. It was a blast.
Well, thank you once again to Andrew Porwancher for joining us and helping us better understand Theodore Roosevelt's unique relationship with the Jewish community. That's all for today's episode of Conversations with B'nai B'rith. Thank you once again to Andrew Porwancher for joining us and for sharing the story behind American Maccabee. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with others, post about it on social media, and leave us a comment or a rating. Follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for more great content. We'll be back soon with more thoughtful conversations on Jewish history, culture, and the issues that matter most to our community. Until then, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.